Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Steve Neiland, and he is the senior developer at SiteVision. And he's joining us here from Florida, where it's probably hot and sunny and humid, as it usually is in Florida at this time of the year.
It's only 80 degrees.
Only 80 degrees. All right. Well, that will get you ready for Washington, D.C., the height of summer, where you're going to be in a few weeks at CF.Objective. And today's episode, Stephen and I are going to talk about going modular with FW1, Framework 1, using subsystems. And he's going to talk about the 2.0 version of that. And we'll look at what Framework 1 is, for those of you who don't know, and why you should be using a framework, and bean factories and all other exciting things to do with that. And also about subsystems and how you enable them and access them, and whether you should be using them, and if so, how. And we'll also have a look at CF.Objective, and maybe we'll mention Lucy a little bit too. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Now, I hear you have a slight accent. Were you originally from a country in Europe?
Yes, I'm from County Cork, Ireland, originally.
Fabulous. Sounds beautiful. So you gave up rainy, damp weather to have hot and sunny Floridian weather.
Yes, and I'm not going back. I like being warm.
Well, I can understand that. I used to live in England, and I found it a bit rainy and dark in the winter.
Oh my, what part of England were you in?
Oh, I was in a town called Maidenhead in Berkshire, which was in the south. It still is in the south as far as I know.
You hope.
Yes,
might
I
have
hope.
Washed away, you never know.
Yes, might have done. Well, let's start for those folks who don't know what Framework 1 is. What exactly is it, FW1?
Okay, well, this is a question I've had to answer for a few people recently. So to understand Framework 1, you have to understand what is a framework. And basically, a framework is a convention of libraries that you use to organize your code. And there's been many frameworks over the years. The big one used to be FuseBox. Now we have Framework 1, ColdBox, CF Wheels. I'm sure there's a few others I'm not mentioning. But Framework 1 and ColdBox are the big names these days. And basically, it just helps multiple developers organize their code in a consistent way. And it gives you all different advantages depending which one you use. But the main concept is organize your code consistently.
That sounds like a good thing to do, and probably makes maintenance a lot easier on the code.
You would think. I've seen some abuses of frameworks that would make you think they would be better off not using one. But in general, if you've got a decent developer, they will take the advantage of a framework.
And, we did a survey, the State of the Union survey, and the Framework 1 and ColdBox, and still FuseBox is still a popular framework out there. But one of the other ones is the homebrew framework, where people come up with some way of organizing the files. Why would you recommend someone use something like Framework 1 rather than just coming up with some method themselves?
Well, I would recommend anyone use Framework 1 or ColdBox or any of the other open source frameworks over their homebrew, for the simple reason that as you upgrade your engines from CF8, CF9, CF10, Rilo, Lucy 4.5, Lucy 5, things will change, and it's much better to have someone else work out the bugs in the framework and you deal with your problem domain than having you to work on your framework and the problem domain with the bugs. So, plus there are a lot of smart guys who build these frameworks, like Sean Corfield is the guy behind Framework 1. He's a lot smarter than me in many aspects. He knows frameworks inside and out. He worked originally on FuseBox, I believe, before he created Framework 1. So
he did.
Yeah. So I like to think of it as using someone else's framework. It allows you to stand on the shoulder of giants.
That makes sense totally. So, having said we should be using a framework, and there's several of them out there, why use Framework One over other frameworks?
Well, I'm not going to say that Framework One is the best framework or it's the worst framework. Like they all have different advantages. For me, Framework One is a very easy framework to get into. Like Framework One and ColdBox do, I'd say 90% of the same things. And then ColdBox then gives you 600 other things you could do that you might not necessarily need to, where Framework One is a very lean framework. It does one thing very well, whereas ColdBox can do everything very well if you know how to configure it, or if you can read through the mountain of documentation that is ColdBox.
That makes sense. So it depends what kind of thing you're looking for. Do you want the framework to do a lot of things for you, or would you rather it stays out of your way and just does one thing good?
Yeah, and that would be the same way why I would use, say, Taffy for building an API. Taffy being a REST API framework, because it does one thing very well. You don't need to learn all the other things it needs to do.
Makes sense. Cool. So we're convinced we should be using Framework One, but what are these new subsystems that are in Framework One?
Well, actually, subsystems are not new to Framework One. They were in the 1.0 build of Framework One. Sean didn't add them to the system. They were actually added by another person who I would like to give credit to, if I can think of his name, and I have it on my notes. Ryan Cogswell. Ryan Cogswell.
Oh, okay, Ryan.
Yeah,
all right.
He added it to Framework One back in 2009. What they are basically is Framework One, by its nature, is a very flat structure. You have the hierarchy is you have sections, and in each section you have items. So you would have, say, a user section, and then an item would be user.edit or user.save or user.delete, which is fine for most applications, but sometimes you will want an extra nesting. So you might say have a calendar list and calendar list.edit, calendar list.save. So it gives you that third level where you can group your code more logically. What's different about Subsystems 2.0 is how they're configured. Like the old subsystems, to enable them, you had to jump through a few hoops, which was always an issue for me. You had to add an environment variable, move around all your existing code, create another set of folders for some other code. And at the end of the day, it was a bit of a pain, and it wasn't very well explained what the benefits were. So most people never actually used subsystems. Whereas Subsystems 2.0, to add them to your application, you create a directory called Subsystems, and then you just drop in a particular subsystems code, and it's just done.
So it's a kind of module of code, maybe analogous to a WordPress plugin, or
I wouldn't say a plugin, because subsystems are not plugins, but they are modules. So how I would describe it is a subsystem is a cut down version of a normal Framework One application. So it has the same conventions, same folder structures, but it's something you can just drop in. So you can drop in your security system for creating your users and authenticating, which is probably the most common use of a subsystem when you're doing modular design.
And do subsystems have some UI elements as well, or are they purely a functional?
No, they're completely UI. Like I said, they are a cut down version of a standard framework and an application. So you have your model a subsystem has its own model directory, it has its own controllers, it has its own view files, it has its own layouts, its own CSS. So, and that's all code that you can just drop into one or more other applications to use out of the box.
And it sounds somewhat similar to ColdBox modules.
It is very similar to ColdBox modules. In fact, it's a lot of the conventions and concepts are the same. It's just the difference between the implementations.
So you mentioned there's a lot of new features in the 2.0 version. Tell us about some of those. For example, how do you enable subsystems now?
Okay. Well, as I said, to enable subsystems in 2.0, you create a directory in your main application called Subsystems, and then you drop in your subsystem into it, and it just works. And that
sounds too easy.
Well, it sounds too easy, but it's just that easy. Like, once you've written your subsystem to work correctly, you can drop it into any Framework 1 application that's version 3.5 or above.
Wow. And so in the version 1.0, it was more complicated, I believe.
Yeah, in the version 1, you actually had to move all your existing Framework 1 code into a subdirectory called home, and then all your layouts into a directory called common, and then you had to create another directory for your subsystem and drop your code into that. Then you had to go change some environment variables and do some wiring up. It really did not go along with the Framework 1 methodology of being convention over configuration, because it actually made you do a lot of configuration, which I attribute a lot to the fact that it was not something Sean built into it from day one.
Well, that sounds much better. So once you've dropped your subsystem into your app, how do you use it?
Okay, so basically to access a subsystem, if you look at the URL structure of a normal Framework 1 application, the URL query string will read action equals section.item. So where section.item would be users.edit. To access a subsystem, the URL string changes to be action equals subsystem : section.item. So that would be calendar : day.edit or calendar : event.add. So, and that's literally it.
That sounds really easy for use, and it makes the code easy to read too.
Yeah, and it makes navigation really simple, because the helper functions that build links in the application, it's called build URL. It's does all the thinking for you. Like, it's all relative addressing, so you can have build URL item.edit, and if you've dropped that subsystem into your application 1 and you've named the subsystem events calendar, it knows that it's in events calendar : user.edit, whereas it can be in pickup calendar in a totally different application, and it does all the auto-wiring itself.
Cool. So what else is new in 2.0 subsystems?
Most of what else is new in subsystems is the conventions and a lot of back-end code to make things just work automatically. For example, the bean factories are much easier to use. Before, like, you still can use different bean factories, but since version 3 of Framework 1, DI1, the dependency injection framework that Sean built, has been bundled with Framework 1, and it just auto-wires straight into the subsystems as well.
And for those people listening who don't know what a bean factory is, what is a bean factory?
Okay, so without getting too technical, in a bean factory, you have your model, which is your services, your gateways, your beans. Like, you might have a user bean, which would describe a user, a day bean, which might describe a particular day in your calendar. And without a bean factory, you have to do a lot of manual wiring up to, say, when you're in the calendar, create an array of days and create a CF object for this path, and then that has a dependency on the day's gateway, which does the querying. And what DI1 does, and all the other DI1 frameworks do, is you just define a property at the top of your CFC file, and you might say user's gateway or user service, and DI1 will read all your controllers, all your service directories, your gateways, and say, oh, you need this other bean, so here's a reference to it, and you can just use it. It takes a lot of the manual wiring up out of it.
And how does that relate to dependency injection?
Well, that is basically what dependency injection is.
Oh,
it reads all your CFCs and sees that, oh, you need a reference to this other object, so here's your reference, instead of you having to manually inject it.
Got it. So you don't need to use a separate dependency injection framework if you're doing that?
No, because DI1 is part of Framework 1 now. But if you want, you can go ahead and use ColdBox's version, which I believe is called... I actually don't remember what the ColdBox version is, but I know it's a standalone version that you can load in as well. Or if you are feeling particularly masochistic, you can just write your own dependency injection framework. But I
think we left the masochistic listeners behind when we said we're going to use an open source framework instead of coding our own. So, or I hope we did.
So yeah.
Wirebox was the thing.
Wirebox, that's the one.
Yes.
And I actually used Wirebox with Framework 1 back in the 2.0 days before DI1 became bundled. And I must say, I prefer DI1 to Wirebox, but that's my own preference.
So having got all this stuff working, which is now very easy to do, why should folks listening be using subsystems?
Well, it all depends on the kind of shop you are. If you are building a single application that you support and that's it, then subsystems, they're going to give you minimal benefit. They're going to give you that extra bit of organizing your code, and that's about it. If, on the other hand, you're like SiteVision, where we have multiple similar applications that are in different domains, and you want to share code between them, that's when you get the benefit. For example, we have, I'll take 3 examples. We have an application that is used for trash pickups for a county. So then we have another application that's used by veterinarians. And then we have another application that's used by emergency services. And they're all very different applications, but they all have one thing in common, which is security. Like they all have users, accounts, permissions, groups. So when we create those applications, the old way you would do it is you would copy across your security code from one application to the next one and modify it as needed for that application. And then you would build another application for someone else, copy across that security application, modify the security code for there. But now you've got 3 different versions of the same security code. And if you have a bug in the first version, you now have to fix it in 3 separate places. Whereas with a security subsystem, that's its own repo, its own source code repo. And if you find a bug in it, you fix it in one place and deploy it to the 3 different applications, and they all get that fix straight away. And there are many other examples.
So you're dropping a copy of the code into the subsystem directory in all 3 places, but you're maintaining that subsystem in Git or some other place to keep it centralized.
Yeah, separate to your application.
Got it. So sounds like a no-brainer to use subsystems. Are there any times when you shouldn't be using them?
There are a few cases. You really need to define what is unique to your application as opposed to what is shareable to your application, like security and authentication. That is going to be the same in every application, but like a calendar is going to be pretty much the same between every application. But then trash pickups, like the definition of a trash pickup is going to be different from the definition of an appointment for your dog to get fixed. So those parts are where they go into your core application versus a subsystem.
And does Framework 1 do auto wiring of these subsystems, or?
Yes, everything is auto wired.
So tell folks what that means. Just why would they care?
Okay, well, basically what the auto wiring does is you drop in your security subsystem into your application. Your subsystem has its own model with beans and services and controllers, and they all have dependencies on each other. And Framework 1 goes along and says, oh, here's a new subsystem with its own controllers. I'm going to wire it in so when someone hits this URL, they find it. I'll find the services, wire it up to the controller, so it all will just run. So it's a minimal configuration. There is some configuration with subsystems, but that is depending on what your requirements are. For example, taking the security system. So on one of our applications, we might say users need to change their password every 90 days. Another one might say we need to change their password every 2 months or every 1 day or every 5 logins. So we have feature flags that we set up we set up defaults in the subsystem, and then in your application.cfc, we provide overrides. So application A, we say days to reset password equals 90. The second application, we say days to reset equals 0, i.e. never reset. So it's the same code, but different behaviors depending on those feature flags.
That makes sense if you're reusing code that you need to do something like that to tweak how it behaves. So I'm going to link in the show notes. There's a nice piece of documentation using subsystems in Framework 1 that's on the GitHub Framework 1 documentation set. And if folks are interested in learning more about subsystems, I think that's a good place to start. Are there any other resources you can recommend for subsystems?
I've done a couple of previous presentations to this one, so they are going to be available on my GitHub account once I update this version, and there will be actual sample applications there implementing the different concepts, because we've only scratched the surface of what subsystems can do.
Okay, that sounds great. So we'll put a link into that as well in the show notes. So anything else you want to share about subsystems before we move to a separate topic?
No, I think we've covered enough to get people interested. If they want to learn more, they can come to my presentation at CF.Objective.
Fabulous. So let's just change topic. Why are you proud to use ColdFusion?
I'm proud to use ColdFusion because it was one of the original scripting languages for web applications, as old as PHP, which I don't think a lot of people recognize. And it just makes things easy. There are naysayers who say, oh, your arrays begin at 1 instead of 0. But I think it was a language that was built for real people as opposed to computer scientists. And I believe they've kept to that goal, both Adobe and Lucy.
Yeah, definitely easy to get started in, though that doesn't mean it can't be powerful if you need to take it in a more computer sciencey direction.
Exactly, and which is something that we're doing at SiteVision. We're taking it beyond the script kiddie type application to real high stakes usage, because we work with emergency departments and hospitals, and so it's a language that we feel confident in using in those environments.
Fabulous. So some people have said ColdFusion is dying, but what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
For me, I think ColdFusion, from a technical point of view, is not dying. What I believe is, and has always been the issue, in my opinion, with CFML, let's call it CFML, because it's really not just ColdFusion, it's Lucy, is PR. Adobe has never really marketed ColdFusion to the masses, and they've always been very Fortune 500, big corporation type clients they've gone after, which doesn't get it into schools and the mainstream. And Lucy has done a lot, and before them Rilo, to make it available to people who don't have big corporate checkbooks. But the marketing has always been a weak point, in my opinion. And I do know that Lucy has been doing a bit with marketing. I know they've had Gert France traveling around pitching it to, I want to say universities, although I could be wrong, but he's been actively marketing it. But I believe it needs more in the marketing department, because the language is stable, it's solid, it doesn't have any quirks, it's got a good support base. It just needs visibility.
That makes sense. So what are you looking forward to at CF.Objective this year?
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing Adobe back at CF.Objective. They weren't at the last one when it was Dev.Objective, and I believe they're sponsoring it this year. So I think that is a very positive thing for the community. I'm also looking forward to hanging out with the Lucy guys and seeing what new awesome things they've got in store. Because I know they've got good things in store. They're always working on something, but they keep it close to their chest until their sessions.
Right. And I know Gert's talk has a couple of talks this year. So should be some good stuff there. Oh, I think one of the things is speeding up the loading time. So.
Hint, hint, use Lucy.
There you go. So I know last year Dev.Objective had a few issues. What would it take to make CF.Objective even more alive?
Well, that's a very tough question to answer, because I don't believe that CF.Objective or Dev.Objective or whatever its name is doing anything wrong, or that there's anything more they could be doing to promote the conference. Maybe they can be doing a bit more PR at other conferences. I don't know. I really think CF.Objective is a reflection of the public view of CFML. And I believe that Adobe, with their marketing of CF Summit, has taken away some of the big names who have been going to CF.Objective. I think they're going to go to CF Summit instead. Lucy, I think they need to step up their game marketing-wise and more active with the blog posts and doing the raw, we're awesomeness. Because I think as you promote the language, as the language becomes popular, it will feed into CF.Objective in terms of attendance.
That makes sense to me. So you mentioned Lucy there. What would it take to have Lucy be more alive this year?
Oh, more alive. Well, I've been somewhat vocal on some of the things that Lucy has not been doing very well in the past. for example, documentation has always been a weak point of Lucy, because no one likes writing documentation. But I think when you have an open source language, the documentation is at least 50% of the product, and they've neglected that up until very recently. So I would really like to see them continue to expand on the documentation and make it much more comprehensive and much easier to get into. Obviously, the marketing. There are also some technical issues with Lucy. I've noticed a couple of posts by the likes of Adam Cameron and others who've done real comparative testing of CFML against other languages. And in fact, there was one today about comparing Moment.js versus CFML, and it was quite disappointing to see how many times both the CFML engines failed versus Moment.js. And I would like to see that be addressed, like a big push to say, what are the other languages doing better than us, and how can we get up there?
Cool. So if folks wanted to find you online, what's the best ways to do that?
To speak with me, normally Twitter is the best way to get me. I tweet at @Neiland. Otherwise, I have my website, neiland.net. I haven't been a very prolific blogger the past year because I've been working on other things. And in the last month or two, I may have broken my blog in terms of the publish feature. But I plan to fix that after the conference.
All right. And do you have some attraction to dinosaurs? I see Godzilla on your Twitter profile.
That came from my previous jobs where I was upgrading a application from Fusebox, and I kept running across code that made me go facepalm.
Oh, all right.
So and one day I came across code. I was like, no, this code is so bad, even Godzilla would facepalm. And then I found it. So that's what it means.
All right. That explains that. I had always wondered about that. Well, I really appreciate you joining us on the CF Alive podcast, Stephen.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Great.